Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite things, and that is making bread. We're going to be making sub rolls or hoagie rolls, whatever you want to call it. And I mix everything up in my KBS bread machine and then roll it out, as you'll see later in the video. So to start off with, I just put 355 grams of warm water. And I did measure this out using my scale, but the recipe that I go by has both the measurements for grams and if you want to do it in like cups and tablespoons. So after I added the warm water, I did 25 grams of honey, and then I also added 56 grams of unsalted butter that I melted slightly. You don't want it hot, but you want it slightly melted. Now with this hoagie recipe, I have only always used bread flour to make it. However, I did want to use freshly milled flour this time, so I did a combination of soft white wheat and spelt. And I just want to say, spelt has recently become one of my favorite grains to work with. It has this great buttery smell and taste to it. It acts a lot like the soft wheat. It's just honestly delicious. It is actually considered one of the ancient grains. Even though it's one of the younger ones, it's still considered an ancient grain. So I do really, really like it. But you're going to do whatever combination you want of soft and spelt or just soft wheat. But you want to do roughly 512 grams of flour. And I say roughly 512 grams. I mean, that's a great place, obviously, to start. It's the recipe. However, what I've noticed with fresh milled flour is sometimes it acts a little bit differently. Depending on the grains that you're using, depending on the moisture content in the air, how long you want it to sit, things like that. So it's really been a learning process, in my opinion, to make sure that you understand what the consistency should be and if you need to potentially add a little more or a little less, and not just following the recipe, to an absolute T. Also for this recipe, like I said earlier, you can just use bread flour. That's what the recipe actually calls for. I just decided to use the fresh milled flour. Now with fresh milled flour, I usually add about 2 tablespoons of additional liquid for every cup that I'm using of fresh milled flour. That was just a conversion I saw somewhere and it's worked pretty well so far. I didn't do it this time for this recipe and it turned out great. However, it had been raining a lot, so I'm sure that had something to do with it. But once you add flour of choice, around the outside you're going to do 6 grams of salt, and then in the middle you're going to do 7 grams of bread machine yeast or active yeast. Now if your yeast is a little bit older, you can put a little bit more. I usually put a little bit more, but the recipe does call for 7 grams. And if you're using the KBS bread machine, you're just going to plug it in to turn it on, and then you are going to select mode 12 so that it will mix the dough and do one complete rise. And you just want to make sure you're brushing down the sides to get everything well incorporated. Then once the bread machine is finished doing what it does best, mixing it, you're going to flour your surface so that you can roll out your hoagie rolls. And this recipe makes 4 pretty decent size hoagie sub rolls. And this dough was actually pretty wet. I did have to add some more flour, as you'll see, but that is completely okay. I just added bread flour as I needed until it got to the consistency that I wanted. And I will say, it is so much easier to add flour than it is to add liquid when it comes to the state. So I always prefer for my dough to be a little bit on the wet side. I mean, this was a lot on the wet side, but that was okay. We just continued to add more flour, and you see that it firmed right up. I think I ended up adding about 10 tablespoons of additional bread flour, but I just kept adding a little bit at a time. I made a little pile for myself, and I would just add it as I felt like it was needed until it really just had this really good bread consistency. And it does take a little bit of time to learn, like working with dough in general, but especially with fresh milled flour, there's just a learning curve that I think you just have to get in there and play with it and figure it out, and you will learn it. It just takes a little bit of time. So once you get your dough where you want it to be, and as you can see, I felt like this was a pretty good consistency for this dough. I cleaned up my little workstation super quickly. Bench scrapers are great for that. And then I didn't have parchment paper, but I did have semolina flour, so I just put some semolina flour on the baking sheet And then for this, I really wanted it to be pretty exact, so I went ahead and weighed it out so that I would know exactly how much for each one. And on this day, my cutting skills were actually pretty on point, so it was pretty easy to get them the way that I wanted them. And then you're just going to shape them into a sub roll or hoagie roll, whatever you're using these for. And then you're going to sit them on the baking sheet, and you want to let them rise until they double, about 30 to 45 minutes. Now I do put a little bit of flour on top, that's just so it doesn't stick. And then I went ahead and preheated my oven to 375. But if you know, my oven is 25 degrees off, so I went to 400. And then I made a quick egg wash just with 1 egg and 2 tablespoons of water so that I could brush that on top. And you really want to make sure you don't overproof these sub rolls so that they won't fall flat. So once it was time, I just went ahead and did a quick egg wash. And if you're going to, I believe it's called laming, but basically cutting the slits in the bread. If you're going to do that, you do want to egg wash it first. And then I put a little bit of coarse salt on top because I wanted that saltiness when you bit into it. And then I used my lame to cut just a straight line down the middle because I wanted that classic sub roll look. Then you put it in the oven and you are going to bake for 16 to 23 minutes or until golden brown. It should be 200 degrees Fahrenheit on the inside. You can use like a tester to test that. And I did with these because I wanted it to be perfect, and mine were about 205 degrees, so they were good to go. Now, since this was the first time of me making these particular sub rolls with fresh milled flour, I really wasn't 100% sure how they were going to turn out, but they turned out great. Now you'll see it did stick a little bit to the bottom. I guess I should have added a little bit more semolina, but that was okay. I brushed it off and we were good to go. No harm, no foul. But these literally turned out delicious. They were so good and they were so soft on the inside. Just made the perfect sub roll. You're gonna see now when I cut it open exactly how soft they really were. And I've noticed with fresh milled flour, I don't always get the softest bread. Sometimes it can be a little bit dense, and maybe it was because I added a little bit of just plain bread flour. I've noticed if you do a mixture of fresh milled flour and regular all-purpose or regular bread flour, you do get a little bit softer inside, but these turned out, in my opinion, kind of perfect. Now I do scoop a little bit of the inside out when I make a sub. It's just because I like my stuff to just kind of sit down in there, and I just made a simple salad dressing to go on top. And like I said, these turned out delicious. I was so impressed with these sub rolls. If you're into fresh milled flour, I suggest trying it. And if you're just using plain flour, these still are really, really, really good sub rolls. So I highly recommend this recipe. I'll link it below. And if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. And thank you so much. And until next time, bye.